Why did my stepdad believe his sister instead of taking me to the ER for my allergic reaction? The shrimp hit my plate at my stepdad Raymond's birthday dinner, and I immediately felt the first warning signs. I was 15 years old, sitting at a crowded table at Giuseppe's Italian restaurant with my mom, my stepdad, his sister Denise, and about 12 other relatives I barely knew. The waiter had just brought out the seafood pasta special that Raymond had insisted everyone try, his treat for his 50th birthday celebration. I looked down at the pink curves of shrimp nestled in the linguine and felt my stomach drop. I told Mom about my shellfish allergy when I was 12, after a school lunch incident with crab cake sent me to the nurse's office with hives and breathing difficulties. The school had documented it, sent home paperwork, recommended we get an EpiPen. Mom had promised to tell Raymond when they got married 8 months ago, but I wasn't sure she ever had. I raised my hand to get Mom's attention across the table, but she was deep in conversation with Raymond's brother about their upcoming cruise. The tingling started in my lips and tongue within 30 seconds of the plate arriving, even though I hadn't taken a bite. Cross-contamination from the kitchen, or maybe just the proximity to the allergen. I knew from past experience that I had maybe 5 to 10 minutes before things got serious. I stood up quickly, knocking my water glass over, and the cold liquid spread across the white tablecloth. Everyone stopped talking and looked at me. Raymond's sister, Denise, a large woman with platinum blonde hair and an opinion about everything, immediately said in a loud voice that I was being dramatic and clumsy, that I needed to sit down and stop making a scene at Raymond's birthday dinner. I tried to explain that I was allergic to shellfish, that I needed to leave immediately, but my tongue was already swelling and the words came out slurred and unclear. Mom finally looked up and saw my face, and I watched her expression change from annoyance to concern. She started to stand, but Denise put a hand on her arm and said in that authoritative tone she always used that I was fine, that teenagers always caused drama for attention, and that she'd raised 4 boys and knew when a kid was faking. Denise worked as a medical assistant at a dermatology clinic and never let anyone forget it, constantly offering unsolicited medical opinions at family gatherings. She told Mom that food allergies were mostly psychological, that kids claimed to be allergic to things they didn't like, and that forcing me to sit through dinner would teach me not to manipulate situations. Raymond looked between me and his sister, and I saw the moment he made his choice. He told me to sit down, that Denise knew what she was talking about, that we weren't leaving his birthday dinner because I didn't want to eat seafood. My throat was closing up now, each breath requiring conscious effort, and I could feel hives rising on my neck and arms. I tried to tell him this was serious, that I needed an ambulance, but my voice came out as a whisper, and my vision was starting to blur at the edges. Mom stood up and said we needed to go, that something was clearly wrong, but Denise grabbed her wrist and told her she was being manipulated by a spoiled teenager who wanted attention. She said that if we left Raymond's birthday dinner, it would ruin the entire evening and embarrass him in front of his family. I stumbled toward the restaurant exit, my legs feeling weak and disconnected. The hostess asked if I was okay, and I tried to say I needed help, but no sound came out anymore. My throat had closed completely. I could see her mouth moving, asking questions, but the sound was muffled like I was underwater. She grabbed a manager, and they helped me outside to the sidewalk where the cool evening air hit my face. I was wheezing now, fighting for each breath, my chest tight and my heart racing. The manager pulled out his phone and started dialing 911, but Raymond appeared and grabbed the phone from his hand, saying there was no emergency, that his stepson was being dramatic, that his sister was a medical professional and had assessed the situation. The manager looked confused and asked if I had asthma or allergies, and Raymond said no, that I was fine, that Denise had confirmed I was having an anxiety attack and just needed to calm down. The manager reluctantly put his phone away, clearly uncomfortable but not willing to argue with a paying customer. I collapsed onto the sidewalk, my body convulsing as I tried to force air into my lungs. My skin felt like it was on fire, covered in raised welts that itched and burned simultaneously. I could feel my face swelling, my eyes almost swollen shut, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was dying. Raymond stood over me telling me to stop this nonsense, to get up and come back inside, that I was embarrassing him in front of his entire family on his birthday. Mom came running out with her purse, keys in hand, saying she was taking me to the hospital regardless of what anyone thought. Denise followed her, still insisting that I was faking, that giving in to this manipulation would set a terrible precedent. She said that when her boys tried to get out of things they didn't want to do, she never gave in, and that's why they'd grown up to be responsible adults. She told Raymond that if he let Mom take me to the ER, I'd learn that dramatic behavior got rewarded, and he'd deal with this kind of thing constantly. Raymond stood there looking between his wife and his sister, and I watched him choose again. He told Mom that Denise was right, that we needed to set boundaries, that taking me to the ER would cost thousands of dollars for what was clearly an anxiety attack. I tried to reach for Mom, to signal that this wasn't manipulation, that I was actually dying on the sidewalk outside an Italian restaurant, while my stepdad debated the cost of my life. But my arms wouldn't respond anymore, and the edges of my vision were going dark. Mom was crying now, arguing with Raymond, saying she didn't care what it cost, or what Denise thought, that her son was clearly having a medical emergency. Denise pulled out her phone and showed Raymond something, some article about teenage anxiety and attention-seeking behavior, using it as evidence that she was right. Raymond nodded along, convinced by his sister's confidence and the apparent authority of a medical assistant's opinion. A couple walking past stopped and asked if they should call an ambulance, and Denise immediately said no, that everything was under control, that she was a medical professional and the situation was being handled. The couple looked at me lying on the sidewalk struggling to breathe and looked skeptical, but Denise assured them in that authoritative voice that I was fine, just having a panic attack, and they moved on reluctantly. Mom tried again to get to me, but Raymond physically held her back, telling her they needed to present a united front, that giving in to my manipulation would undermine their marriage. He said that Denise had helped raise him and knew what she was talking about, that trusting her judgment was important to their family dynamic. I felt my consciousness slipping away, the world narrowing to a tiny point of light surrounded by darkness. My last coherent thought was that my stepdad was letting me die to avoid embarrassing his sister at his birthday dinner. Then everything went black, and I stopped feeling the pain, the fear, the desperate need for air. I was floating in a void where nothing hurt anymore, where I didn't have to fight to breathe, where the terrible itching and swelling and burning all faded into nothing. I heard voices from far away, panicked and urgent, but they didn't seem to matter anymore. The struggling was over. I woke up to the sound of machines beeping and the smell of antiseptic. My throat felt raw and swollen, and I had an oxygen mask over my face. When I tried to move, I realized I was strapped to a hospital bed with IV lines running into both arms. A nurse appeared immediately, adjusting something on one of the machines and asking me to stay calm, that I'd been intubated, and they'd just removed the breathing tube an hour ago. She said I'd had a severe anaphylactic reaction, that my throat had closed completely, and that I'd stopped breathing on the sidewalk. Someone had finally called 911 after I lost consciousness, and the paramedics had administered epinephrine and performed CPR for almost 3 minutes before getting my heart restarted. Mom was asleep in a chair in the corner, her face blotchy from crying, still wearing her dress from the dinner. When she woke up and saw I was conscious, she started sobbing so hard she couldn't speak, just held my hand and kept saying she was sorry, that she should have listened to her instincts, that she should have ignored Raymond and Denise and gotten me help immediately. The doctor came in a few minutes later, a tired-looking woman named Dr. Amira Kassab, who explained that I'd experienced anaphylactic shock from shellfish exposure, that I'd been in critical condition when the ambulance arrived, and that another minute or two of delay would have resulted in permanent brain damage or death. She asked why there had been such a significant delay in calling for help, and Mom broke down completely, explaining about the birthday dinner and Denise's insistence that I was faking and Raymond's refusal to let her call 911. Dr. Kassab's expression hardened as she listened, and she made notes in her tablet with sharp, angry keystrokes. She said that anaphylaxis was a well-documented, time-critical emergency, that delaying treatment was extraordinarily dangerous, and that whoever had prevented me from receiving immediate medical care had endangered my life. She asked if the person who'd stopped us from calling 911 had any actual medical training, and Mom explained that Denise was a medical assistant at a dermatology office. Dr. Kassab said that a medical assistant had no business diagnosing an allergic reaction, that preventing someone from calling 911 during a medical emergency was potentially criminal, and that she'd be filing a report with hospital administration and possibly with Child Protective Services. Raymond showed up an hour later, looking defensive and angry rather than concerned or apologetic. He immediately started justifying his actions, saying that Denise had been certain I was faking, that food allergies were overdiagnosed, that he'd been trying to prevent unnecessary medical expenses. Mom stood up and told him to get out, that he'd nearly killed her son by choosing his sister's opinion over obvious medical distress. Raymond argued that anyone could have made the same mistake, that I'd been manipulative and dramatic before, and that Denise had medical experience that made her assessment credible. Dr. Kassab interrupted and said that what he was describing was medical neglect of a minor, that his refusal to allow emergency treatment for a documented allergic reaction constituted child endangerment, and that the hospital was legally required to report the incident. The next few days were a blur of medical tests, visits from social workers, and police interviews. The paramedics who'd responded to the scene had documented that I'd been in full cardiac arrest when they arrived, that bystanders reported a delay of at least 15 minutes between my collapse and the 911 call, and that family members had actively prevented people from calling for help. One of the bystanders, a nursing student, had recorded part of the incident on her phone, capturing Denise telling people I was faking, and Raymond physically preventing Mom from calling 911. The video showed me clearly unconscious on the sidewalk, while they stood over me arguing about whether I was manipulating the situation. Child Protective Services opened an investigation immediately. The caseworker, a stern woman named Patricia Volkov, interviewed me extensively about the incident and about my home life with Raymond. I told her about other times when Raymond had dismissed my medical complaints, usually after consulting with Denise. The time I'd had strep throat and Denise said I was faking to get out of school, and I'd ended up hospitalized with a kidney infection after the untreated strep caused complications. The time I'd twisted my ankle playing basketball and Denise said I just wanted attention, and I'd walked on a fractured ankle for 2 weeks before Mom finally took me to a doctor behind Raymond's back. The time I'd had pneumonia and Denise diagnosed it as anxiety over a test, and I'd ended up in the ER 3 days later with a fever of 104. Patricia's expression grew darker as I recounted each incident, and she asked why Mom hadn't intervened more forcefully. I explained that Raymond controlled all the finances, that Mom had given up her job when they married because Raymond said a wife should focus on home and family, and that she was financially dependent on him. Patricia asked if Raymond had ever been physically abusive, and I said no, just controlling and dismissive, especially when Denise was involved. She asked if I felt safe going home, and I honestly didn't know how to answer. Raymond had let me die to avoid contradicting his sister, and that seemed like a fundamental betrayal that couldn't be fixed with an apology. The police investigation proceeded in parallel with CPS. Detective Marcus Riley, who specialized in child endangerment cases, reviewed all the evidence including the bystander's video, the paramedic reports, the hospital records, and witness statements. He explained that Washington state law made it a crime to recklessly endanger a child's health or safety, and that preventing medical treatment during a life-threatening emergency met that threshold. He said they'd be interviewing Raymond, Denise, and everyone present at the restaurant, and that charges would likely be filed, depending on what those interviews revealed. Raymond hired a lawyer immediately, an expensive defense attorney named Gordon Sheffield, who specialized in defending clients against criminal charges. Gordon's strategy was to claim that Raymond had relied in good faith on Denise's medical expertise, that he'd had no way of knowing she was wrong, and that his actions had been those of a confused stepfather trying to navigate competing opinions. The lawyer argued that Raymond shouldn't be held criminally responsible for trusting a family member who'd presented herself as medically knowledgeable. Detective Riley countered that Raymond had ignored obvious physical symptoms, prevented others from calling for help, and prioritized his sister's opinion over his wife's maternal instincts and the clear distress of a child in his care. Denise also hired a lawyer and immediately started claiming she'd been misunderstood, that she'd never said I was definitely faking, only that anxiety could cause similar symptoms. Her lawyer tried to argue that she'd been offering a differential diagnosis, not preventing medical treatment. But the nursing student's video contradicted that, showing Denise explicitly saying I was faking, grabbing people who tried to call 911, and insisting that she was a medical professional who knew what she was talking about. The video had gone viral online after the nursing student posted it with context about what had happened, and Denise was now facing public outrage and calls for her to be fired from the dermatology clinic. The dermatology clinic where Denise worked initially defended her, saying she was a valued employee who'd never had complaints before. But as the story spread on social media and local news picked it up, the clinic started receiving hundreds of negative reviews and threats to boycott their services. Within a week, they announced that Denise had been placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation into whether her actions violated medical ethics standards for even non-licensed medical staff. The state medical board also opened an investigation into whether Denise had been practicing medicine without a license by diagnosing my condition and preventing treatment. Mom filed for divorce while I was still in the hospital. She'd contacted a family law attorney named Lucinda Hayes, who specialized in cases involving domestic control and financial abuse. Lucinda explained that while Raymond hadn't physically harmed Mom, his pattern of financial control and his prioritization of his sister's opinions over Mom's judgment and my welfare constituted emotional abuse and created an unsafe environment. Lucinda filed for emergency temporary orders giving Mom full custody of me, exclusive use of the marital home, and temporary spousal support. Raymond fought all of it, arguing that Mom was overreacting to a tragic mistake, that he loved both of us, and that we should work through this as a family. The custody hearing happened 2 weeks after the incident. Judge Andrea Novak presided, and she listened to testimony from Dr. Kassab, the paramedics, the nursing student who'd filmed the incident, Patricia from CPS, and both Mom and Raymond. Dr. Kassab testified that the delay in treatment had caused me to suffer cardiac arrest and could easily have resulted in death or permanent brain damage. The paramedics testified that in their 18 years of combined experience, they'd never seen family members actively prevent bystanders from calling 911 during a medical emergency. The nursing student testified about watching me turn blue while Raymond held Mom back, and Denise told everyone I was faking. Raymond's lawyer tried to paint him as a victim of his sister's misguided advice, but Judge Novak wasn't sympathetic. She asked Raymond directly why he'd believed his sister, who was a medical assistant in dermatology, over the obvious physical symptoms of anaphylaxis that anyone with basic first aid training would recognize. Raymond stammered that Denise had always been right about medical things before, that she'd helped his family through various health issues over the years, that he'd trusted her judgment. Judge Novak asked if he understood that his decision to trust his sister, instead of calling for emergency medical help, had resulted in his stepson's heart stopping. And Raymond said yes, but that he'd thought he was doing the right thing at the time. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. She granted Mom full temporary custody of me, gave Mom exclusive use of the marital home, ordered Raymond to pay temporary spousal and child support, and implemented a restraining order requiring Raymond to stay at least 500 feet away from me, unless supervised by a court-approved third party. Judge Novak stated on the record that Raymond's actions constituted child endangerment, regardless of his intentions, that his pattern of prioritizing his sister's opinions over his wife's concerns raised serious questions about his judgment, and that until the criminal case was resolved, she couldn't allow unsupervised contact with a minor child. The criminal charges came a week later. The prosecutor, a woman named Yolanda Mwangi, who'd built her career on child protection cases, filed charges against Raymond for reckless endangerment of a child and criminal neglect. She also filed charges against Denise for practicing medicine without a license and reckless endangerment. Yolanda's charging documents laid out the timeline in devastating detail: the clear symptoms of anaphylaxis, the multiple opportunities to call for help that were blocked, the video evidence of active interference with emergency response, the cardiac arrest that resulted from the delay, and the permanent consequences I was now facing from oxygen deprivation to my brain. Raymond and Denise were both arrested and arraigned. Gordon Sheffield arranged for Raymond to be released on bail, but Denise couldn't afford her bail and spent 3 days in jail before a bail bondsman agreed to post the bond. Both pleaded not guilty and demanded jury trials. Gordon's strategy was to humanize Raymond, to present him as a confused stepfather who'd made a tragic mistake while trying to balance family dynamics. Denise's lawyer, a public defender named Thomas Nguyen, tried to argue that Denise genuinely believed she was helping, that her medical assistant training had given her false confidence, and that she'd never intended to hurt anyone. The pre-trial publicity was extensive. Local news ran stories about the case with headlines like, "Stepfather lets child die to avoid contradicting sister," and "Medical assistant's false diagnosis nearly kills teen." Social media exploded with outrage, with thousands of people sharing the nursing student's video and expressing fury at Raymond and Denise. The restaurant got dragged into it too, with people asking why the staff hadn't called 911 when they saw a child in distress on their sidewalk. Giuseppe's released a statement saying their staff had tried to help, but were told by family members that there was no emergency and they'd followed the family's wishes. I was discharged from the hospital after 5 days, but the damage was permanent. The cardiac arrest had caused mild brain injury from oxygen deprivation, resulting in memory problems and difficulty concentrating. Dr. Kassab explained that I'd need cognitive therapy and might never fully recover the mental sharpness I'd had before. I'd also developed severe anxiety around food, unable to eat anything without obsessively checking ingredients and worrying about allergens. The hospital nutritionist worked with me, but the psychological trauma of nearly dying from food made normal eating almost impossible. My school had to implement special accommodations under a 504 plan, extended time on tests due to cognitive processing delays, permission to record lectures because my memory retention was impaired, access to a quiet room when I had anxiety attacks, and a strict allergy management protocol that required all my teachers and the cafeteria staff to be trained in recognizing anaphylaxis and administering an EpiPen. The school counselor, Mr. Isaiah Bradford, spent an hour each week helping me process the trauma, but I was angry constantly, unable to concentrate on anything except the fact that my stepdad had chosen his sister over my life. Raymond tried to reach out through his lawyer, sending letters apologizing and asking for a chance to explain. Mom refused to pass them to me, and I told her I didn't want to hear from him anyway. I had nothing to say to someone who'd held my mom back while I died on the sidewalk because his sister might be embarrassed if she was wrong. Gordon Sheffield approached Lucinda Hayes about Raymond giving up all parental rights in exchange for dropping the divorce proceedings, but Mom refused. She wanted the divorce finalized and she wanted child support, and she wasn't negotiating with someone who'd endangered her child. The trial for Raymond happened first, 4 months after the incident. Yolanda Mwangi prosecuted aggressively, presenting the timeline, the video evidence, the medical testimony, and my own testimony about lying on the sidewalk unable to breathe while Raymond refused to let anyone call for help. I had to sit on the witness stand and describe the sensation of my throat closing, the panic of trying to breathe and failing, the moment I realized Raymond had chosen his sister over me. The jury watched the nursing student's video showing me unconscious and blue while Raymond argued with Mom about whether to call 911. Gordon Sheffield's defense focused on Raymond's confusion and his reliance on Denise's supposed expertise. He called character witnesses who testified that Raymond was a good man, a devoted brother, someone who'd always tried to do the right thing. He presented expert testimony from a psychologist who explained how people could be manipulated by confident family members claiming medical knowledge, how someone without medical training might genuinely believe a medical assistant over their own observations. The defense tried to paint Raymond as a victim of Denise's overconfidence rather than a perpetrator of child endangerment. But Yolanda destroyed that narrative in cross-examination. She asked Raymond directly why he'd believed his sister over his wife, who was the child's mother, and knew him better than Denise did. She asked why he'd believed his sister over the obvious physical symptoms visible to everyone present. She asked why he'd physically prevented Mom from calling 911, even after I'd lost consciousness. She asked why he'd continued to insist there was no emergency, even after the manager and bystanders had tried to help. Raymond had no good answers, just kept saying he'd trusted Denise, that he'd thought he was doing the right thing. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on both counts of reckless endangerment and criminal neglect. Judge Novak scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. Gordon Sheffield filed immediate notice of appeal, but the judge denied Raymond's request to remain free pending appeal, citing the severity of the offense and the fact that a child had nearly died due to his actions. Raymond was remanded to custody immediately, led out of the courtroom in handcuffs while his family members cried in the gallery. Denise's trial happened 6 weeks later. Thomas Nguyen tried a different strategy, acknowledging that Denise had been wrong, but arguing that she genuinely believed she was helping. that her medical assistant training had given her confidence in assessing symptoms, and that she'd never intended to harm anyone. But Yolanda presented evidence of Denise's pattern of behavior, calling witnesses who testified about other times Denise had diagnosed family members with psychological conditions rather than physical illnesses, always insisting her medical knowledge made her right. The most damaging testimony came from Raymond's ex-wife, a woman named Loretta Finn, who'd been married to Raymond before Mom. Loretta testified that Denise had been a constant problem in their marriage, always inserting her opinions about Raymond's 2 daughters from that marriage, always claiming medical expertise she didn't have. Loretta described an incident where one of Raymond's daughters had broken her wrist, but Denise insisted it was just a sprain, and Raymond had refused to take the girl to the hospital for 2 days until the swelling got so bad that the school nurse threatened to call CPS. Loretta said the pattern had been consistent. Denise would diagnose something as minor or psychological, Raymond would believe her, and children would suffer the consequences. Thomas tried to rehabilitate his client by having Denise testify tearfully that she'd only wanted to help, that she'd never imagined I was actually dying, that she'd live with the guilt forever. But under Yolanda's cross-examination, Denise's testimony fell apart. Yolanda confronted her with the video showing her confidently declaring I was faking even after I'd lost consciousness, showed her statements to bystanders claiming she was a medical professional, asked her to explain why she'd physically grabbed people who tried to call 911. Denise claimed she'd been in shock, that she'd panicked, that she didn't remember being that forceful, but the video evidence contradicted everything she said. The jury found Denise guilty on all counts: practicing medicine without a license, reckless endangerment, and criminal neglect. Thomas argued for leniency at sentencing, noting that Denise had no prior criminal record and had already lost her job and her reputation. But Judge Novak was unmoved. She noted that Denise had used her medical assistant position to claim authority she didn't have, that she'd endangered not just me, but potentially other family members over years of false diagnoses, and that she'd shown no insight into how her overconfidence had nearly killed a child. Raymond was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years of probation. Judge Novak stated that his decision to prioritize his sister's opinion over his stepson's life represented a fundamental failure of parental responsibility, that his pattern of financial control over his wife had created an environment where she couldn't protect her child, and that only significant incarceration would adequately address the severity of his actions. Gordon Sheffield filed appeals, but they were denied at every level. Raymond would serve his full sentence. Denise received a more severe sentence: 30 months in state prison followed by 5 years of probation. Judge Novak explained that Denise's abuse of her medical assistant position, her pattern of false diagnoses over years, and her complete lack of remorse warranted significant incarceration. The judge also ordered that upon release, Denise would be permanently barred from working in any healthcare-related field and would be required to complete psychological counseling to address her need for control and her inability to admit when she was wrong. The civil lawsuit came next. Lucinda Hayes referred us to a personal injury attorney named Victor Langley, who specialized in medical negligence cases. Victor filed suit against both Raymond and Denise for damages, including medical expenses, future medical care related to my brain injury, pain and suffering, and emotional distress. The case was strengthened by the criminal convictions, which established that both defendants had acted recklessly and with disregard for my welfare. Raymond's homeowner's insurance initially refused to cover the claim, arguing that intentional acts of child endangerment weren't covered under the policy, but Victor threatened a bad faith lawsuit, and they eventually settled for their policy limits of $500,000. Denise had no assets and no insurance that would cover her actions, so the judgment against her was largely symbolic. But Victor said it was important to establish the full scope of responsibility, and he obtained a judgment of $750,000 against Denise that she'd never be able to pay, but that would follow her for life. Victor also negotiated with the restaurant's insurance company, arguing that their staff should have called 911 when they saw a child in medical distress on their property, regardless of what family members said. Giuseppe's insurance settled for $100,000 to avoid litigation, though they maintained they'd done nothing wrong. The divorce was finalized while Raymond was in jail. He'd lost his job when he was convicted and couldn't afford Gordon Sheffield's fees anymore, so he represented himself in the divorce proceedings. Judge Novak awarded Mom the house, full custody of me with no visitation rights for Raymond, child support until I turned 18, and permanent spousal support based on the economic harm caused by Raymond's financial control during their marriage. Raymond's retirement accounts and savings were divided, with Mom receiving 60% due to the circumstances. He emerged from the divorce with virtually nothing: no house, no savings, a criminal record, and no relationship with the family he'd supposedly cared about. I struggled with the aftermath more than anyone expected. The brain injury left me with persistent cognitive difficulties that made school increasingly challenging. My grades dropped from A's and B's to C's and D's despite the accommodations, and I had to repeat my sophomore year. The anxiety around food persisted despite therapy, and I lost 30 pounds because I was terrified to eat anything I hadn't prepared myself. Dr. Kassab referred me to specialists who tried various treatments, but the psychological damage from nearly dying while my stepfather argued about whether I was manipulating him proved resistant to intervention. Mom dealt with her own guilt and trauma. She'd been in therapy twice a week since the incident, working through the fact that she'd let Raymond control her to the point where she'd almost lost her son. Her therapist helped her understand that financial abuse was a form of domestic violence, that Raymond's control over money and his dismissal of her maternal instincts had been deliberate tactics to maintain power. Mom started working again, taking a job at a nonprofit that helped domestic violence survivors, using her experience to help other women recognize controlling behavior before it escalated to danger. Raymond sent letters from jail that Mom refused to open. His family members tried to reach out, claiming he'd been punished enough, that he'd made a mistake, but didn't deserve to lose everything. Mom told them all that Raymond had made a choice to believe his sister instead of protecting a child in his care, that the consequences he faced were directly proportional to the consequences I'd face for the rest of my life, and that none of them were welcome in our lives. Raymond's brother tried to argue that family should forgive family, and Mom said that family should also protect family, something Raymond had catastrophically failed to do. The nursing student who'd filmed the incident and posted it online became something of an activist for child medical advocacy. Her name was Zara Phillips, and she'd started a nonprofit called Kids First Medical Trust that educated parents about recognizing real medical emergencies and the dangers of dismissing children's symptoms. Zara reached out to Mom and asked if we'd be willing to share our story as part of their awareness campaign, and after discussing it with my therapist, I agreed. We did a video interview where I described the experience and the lasting consequences, and Mom talked about the red flags she'd missed in Raymond's controlling behavior. The video went viral, racking up millions of views and sparking widespread conversation about parental responsibility, medical misinformation, and the dangers of family members who claimed expertise they didn't have. Medical professionals weighed in, explaining how anaphylaxis worked and why delays in treatment were so dangerous. Psychologists discussed how family dynamics could lead to catastrophically bad decisions. Legal experts analyzed the criminal case and the precedent it might set for prosecuting parents who neglected children's medical needs. 3 years after the incident, I was 18 and preparing to graduate high school a year late. The cognitive effects of the brain injury had improved somewhat with therapy and medication, but I'd never fully recovered my pre-incident mental sharpness. College plans had to be adjusted, and I enrolled in community college rather than the 4-year university I'd planned to attend. The anxiety around food had lessened, but never disappeared, and I still carried 2 EpiPens everywhere and obsessively checked ingredient labels. Raymond was released from jail after serving 16 months with good behavior. He'd lost everything: his career in accounting because of the criminal record, his marriage, his relationship with me, most of his family relationships because they blamed him for destroying the family, and his financial stability. He reached out again through his lawyer, asking if we could meet so he could apologize in person, but I declined. I had nothing to say to him, and nothing I wanted to hear from him. Some betrayals were too fundamental to overcome with words. Denise served her full sentence, and was released with strict probation conditions, including staying away from me and my family, refraining from giving any medical advice to anyone, and attending mandatory counseling. The state medical board issued a permanent order barring her from any healthcare employment, and her professional reputation was destroyed. She'd tried to write a book about her experience, framing herself as a victim of a rush to judgment, but no publisher would touch it after the backlash from victim advocacy groups. Mom rebuilt her life with remarkable resilience, becoming a director at the domestic violence nonprofit and a vocal advocate for recognizing financial abuse as a form of domestic violence. She'd started dating someone new, a teacher named Gregory Huang, who treated her with respect and who'd immediately memorized all my food allergies the first time we met. Gregory never tried to be a father figure, just a supportive presence in my mom's life who understood that trust had to be earned through consistent, safe behavior over time. On the 5th anniversary of the incident, I wrote an essay for Zara's nonprofit about surviving a preventable tragedy. I wrote about the moment on the sidewalk when I'd realized my stepdad was choosing his sister over my life, about the permanent consequences of brain injury and psychological trauma, about the long journey of rebuilding trust in adults, and in my own body's ability to keep me safe. The essay was published on their website and shared widely, reaching parents who might one day face a similar choice and helping them understand the stakes. I'll never know what my life would have been like if Raymond had called 911 when I first collapsed, if he'd believed me instead of Denise, if he'd prioritized my safety over his sister's pride. But I know who I became because he didn't. Someone who understands that family loyalty has limits, that medical emergencies require immediate action regardless of cost or embarrassment, and that when someone shows you they value someone else's opinion over your life, you believe them the first time. Raymond lost 18 months to jail, but I lost the person I would have been if my stepfather had simply chosen differently when it mattered most. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.